Miss Marple and the museum where exhibits became crimes the morning of Tuesday. April the 16th dawned clear and bright over St. Mary Mead, and Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, observing the unusual bustle in the village square. Today marked the reopening of the Caldwell Museum, a modest establishment housed in what had once been the manor house of the long-defunct Caldwell family, after 18 months of renovations funded by a generous bequest. The museum was to unveil its new exhibition, Secrets of the English Countryside: A History in Objects. Miss Marple had received her invitation weeks ago, delivered by hand by young Timothy Ledger, the museum's enthusiastic new curator. The card was embossed with gold lettering, and Timothy had lingered on her doorstep, practically vibrating with excitement as he described the centerpiece of the exhibition, a collection of medieval jewelry discovered during the renovation, hidden behind a false wall in what had been the Caldwell family's private chapel. Now, as she pinned her favorite cameo brooch to her dove-grey cardigan, Miss Marple reflected that reopenings, like weddings and funerals, had a peculiar way of bringing out both the best and worst in people. She had observed this pattern countless times in her 70-odd years, and she suspected today would be no exception. The museum stood at the edge of the village, its honey-colored stone glowing in the spring sunshine. As Miss Marple approached, leaning lightly on her walking stick, she noted the gathering crowd with interest. There was Mrs. Bantry from Gossington Hall, resplendent in a purple ensemble that would have been more suitable for Ascot. Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, stood near the entrance with his wife, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, was engaged in animated conversation with Reverend Clement, while the Reverend's wife, Griselda, attempted to corral their two boisterous children, but it was the cluster of individuals near the museum's grand entrance who drew Miss Marple's particular attention. Timothy Ledger, a thin young man of perhaps 30 with an eager, boyish face, was gesticulating wildly as he spoke to a distinguished-looking woman in her 50s. This, Miss Marple knew, was Professor Diane Ashworth, the historical consultant Timothy had brought in to authenticate the medieval jewelry. Beside them stood Marcus Caldwell, the last surviving member of the family that had once owned the estate. He was a portly man in his 60s, with a florid complexion and an air of barely suppressed irritation. "Vultures," Miss Marple heard him mutter as she passed, "picking over my family's bones for entertainment." Professor Ashworth's expression remained coolly professional. "The collection belongs to the public trust now. Mr. Caldwell, your great-uncle's will was quite explicit." "My great-uncle was senile," Marcus snapped, but his protest was interrupted by Timothy clapping his hands together. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would all please come inside. We're about to begin the official ceremony." The crowd shuffled forward, and Miss Marple found herself swept along into the museum's entrance hall. The interior had been beautifully restored. Original oak paneling gleamed with fresh polish, and the flagstone floors had been expertly cleaned. Glass cases lined the walls, displaying everything from Roman coins found in local fields to Victorian agricultural implements. But the true glory was the central gallery, and as the crowd entered it, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The medieval jewelry was displayed in a purpose-built case at the gallery's heart, dramatically lit from above. There were brooches, rings, and necklaces, each piece glittering with semi-precious stones. The centerpiece was a stunning gold collar inlaid with garnets and sapphires, its craftsmanship so fine that it seemed to capture and reflect every beam of light. "The Caldwell collar," Timothy announced, his voice trembling with pride. Dated to approximately 1340, likely commissioned by Sir Edmund Caldwell upon his return from the Crusades. Professor Ashworth believes it may have been a gift for his wife, Lady Margaret. Professor Ashworth stepped forward, her cultured voice carrying easily through the space. The workmanship suggests continental influence, possibly Venetian. The symbolism in the design indicates it was both an ornament and a talisman. You'll notice the intertwined serpencer, common medieval motif representing wisdom and protection. Miss Marple studied the collar with interest, but she found herself equally fascinated by the people around her. Marcus Caldwell stared at the jewelry with naked resentment, his jaw clenched. Near him, a thin woman in her 40s, whom Miss Marple recognized as Sarah Ledger. Timothy's sister watched her brother with an expression that mingled pride and something else, anxiety, perhaps, or fear. There was also a stranger in the crowd, a dapper man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. He stood slightly apart, examining the displays with the practiced eye of a connoisseur. When he caught Miss Marple looking at him, he smiled politely and moved closer. "Magnificent, isn't it?" he said in a pleasant, educated voice. "I'm Gerald Thornbury, art dealer from London. Young Ledger invited me to see the collection. I must say, he wasn't exaggerating about its quality." "Miss Jane Marple," she replied, shaking his extended hand. "From the village? Do you specialize in medieval pieces, Mr. Thornbury?" "Among other periods. I have several clients who collect historical jewelry. Of course, this particular collection isn't for sale, but one likes to keep abreast of significant discoveries. The provenance alone makes it remarkable." Their conversation was interrupted by Timothy calling for attention once more. He stood beside the display case, practically glowing with excitement. "Before we continue the tour, I want to thank everyone who made this possible. Professor Ashworth for her tireless work authenticating and cataloguing the collection. My sister Sarah, who managed all the administrative details. And, of course, Marcus Caldwell for his family's legacy." He nodded to Marcus, who acknowledged this with a curt nod, his expression unchanged. Now, Timothy continued, producing a small silver key from his pocket, as a special treat for our opening day guests. "I'm going to open the case so you can see the Caldwell collar up close. Please form an orderly queue, and do remember no touching." The crowd pressed forward eagerly. Miss Marple, preferring to avoid the crush, remained at the back of the room, observing. She noticed that Sarah Ledger had moved to stand near the door, her arms crossed tightly. Gerald Thornbury had produced a small notebook and was making careful sketches. Professor Ashworth stood near Timothy, offering scholarly commentary as each guest bent to examine the collar dot. It was Colonel Melchett who first noticed something amiss. He had been one of the last to view the collar, and as he straightened up, Miss Marple quietly moved to a chair near the wall and sat down to observe. She had learned long ago that in moments of crisis, the most revealing information came not from what people said, but from what they did instinctively. Before they had time to compose themselves, Marcus Caldwell was the first to speak, and his voice carried across the gallery. "This is precisely what I warned against. Displaying priceless family heirlooms where any common thief could get at them. That collar should have remained in private hands, properly secured." "The security was state-of-the-art," Timothy protested weakly. "The case is alarmed. The gallery has cameras, then check the cameras." Marcus thundered. Sarah Ledger stepped forward, her face drawn. "Timothy, when did you last verify the collar was genuine? Her brother turned to her, and Miss Marple saw confusion and hurt flicker across his features. This morning. I checked it myself when I opened the museum at 8 o'clock. It was real then, I'm certain of it. The case has been locked since then. Colonel Melchett demanded yes, until just now when I opened it for the viewing. I have the only key. Timothy patted his pocket, then froze. His hand dove into the pocket again, more frantically. It's gone. The key is gone. When did you last have it? Professor Ashworth asked, her voice sharp with professional concern. I used it this morning to check the collar, and I know I put it back in my pocket. I remember specifically because I was worried about losing it. Timothy's voice rose in pitch. Someone must have taken it from my pocket. Gerald Thornbury spoke up from his position near the window. Was the collar ever left unattended between this morning and now? No, Timothy said firmly. I've been in the museum the entire time. Sarah arrived at 9 to help with final preparations. Professor Ashworth came at 9:30. Mr. Caldwell arrived shortly before 10. You arrived just before 11, Mr. Thornbury, and the guests began arriving at 11:30, Sarah added. The ceremony started at noon. The case has been in view of at least one of us the entire time. Miss Marple stirred slightly in her chair. Forgive me, she said in her mild, apologetic voice. But might I ask whether the case requires both a key and an alarm code to open? All eyes turned to her. Timothy nodded. Yes, Miss Marple. The alarm must be deactivated first. Then the case can be unlocked. And who knows the alarm code? Timothy hesitated. I do, obviously. And Sarah, as deputy curator. And Professor Ashworth, I gave it to her in case of emergency during her work with the collection. 3 people, Miss Marple murmured. How convenient for a thief to have such limited options to work with. There was a moment of silence as the implications sank in. Marcus Caldwell broke it with a harsh laugh. Well, there you have it, Colonel. Your thief is one of these 3. I suggest you search them immediately. Now, see here, Caldwell, Colonel Melchett began, but Professor Ashworth cut him off. Mr. Caldwell is not entirely wrong, though his manner is offensive. The logistics of this theft are remarkable. Someone had to obtain Timothy's key, disable the alarm, open the case, switch the collar with a prepared forgery, relock the case, reactivate the alarm, and return the key to Timothy's pocketall without being noticed, and all within a very narrow window of time. Unless the switch was made earlier, Gerald Thornbury suggested. Perhaps last night. Timothy shook his head violently. Impossible. I checked the collar first thing this morning, as I said. It was genuine. How can you be certain? Marcus demanded. Did you examine every detail? Take measurements? Or did you just glance at it? Timothy faltered. I looked at it carefully. I've studied that collar for months. I know every garnet, every link of gold. It was real this morning. Miss Marple noticed that Sarah had gone very pale. The young woman's hands were trembling, though she clasped them together tightly. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Timothy, did you lock your office this morning when you came to check the displays? My office? Timothy looked confused. No, I don't think so. Why? Because that's where you keep the duplicate key to the display cases. The one we had made for emergencies. Sarah's words fell like stones into still water. The implications hung heavy in the air. Colonel Melchett stepped forward. I think we'd better examine that office immediately. And, Ledger, I'm afraid I'll need to call in Scotland Yard. This is beyond the scope of a village investigation. As the colonel moved purposefully toward the exit with Timothy in tow, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her keen eyes moving from face to face. Sarah Ledger looked terrified. Marcus Caldwell appeared grimly satisfied, as though his dire predictions had been vindicated. Professor Ashworth maintained her professional calm, but her fingers drummed nervously against her folder. Gerald Thornbury had moved back to examine the forgery, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Bantry bustled over to sit beside Miss Marple. Jane, isn't this absolutely dreadful? A theft right under our noses. Who do you suppose did it? I'm sure I couldn't say, Dolly, Miss Marple replied gently, though I must admit, there's something rather odd about the whole business. Odd. It seems perfectly straightforward to me. Someone wanted that collar and took it. The question is who? The question, Miss Marple murmured, is why go to such elaborate lengths? A forgery requires time, skill, and detailed knowledge of the original. The theft itself required precise timing and opportunity. This wasn't an impulsive act, Dolly. This was carefully planned, possibly for weeks or months. Well, that certainly narrows the field, Mrs. Bantry said with satisfaction. It must be someone who had access to the collar before today. That young curator, perhaps, or the professor woman. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Her attention had been caught by a small detail. When Timothy had pulled out the forgery to examine it more closely before the colonel had stopped him, she had noticed something. The dust inside the case had been disturbed in an odd pattern, as though something had been dragged across the bottom. And there, barely visible on the glass, was a smudge that might have been a fingerprint or might have been something else entirely. I wonder, she said softly, whether we're all asking the right questions. Everyone assumes the collar was stolen because of its value. But what if there's another reason entirely? What if someone wanted that collar? Spoken like someone who might have her own reasons for wanting attention diverted, Marcus shot back. Tell me, Professor, how much is a medieval jewelry expert's reputation worth? Enough to stage a theft that would guarantee international headlines. Professor Ashworth's expression remained glacial. I have built my reputation over 30 years of scrupulous scholarship. I need neither publicity stunts nor lectures on integrity from a man who attempted to contest his great-uncle's will on the grounds of senility, despite medical evidence to the contrary. My great-uncle was manipulated. In his final years, Marcus said stiffly, that museum should never have received the Caldwell estate. The property and its contents should have remained with the family. Ah, Gerald Thornbury spoke up from his position by the window. Now we come to the heart of the matter. Mr. Caldwell, forgive my bluntness, but you have the most obvious motive here. You opposed the museum from the start. You've made no secret of your belief that the jewelry collection should be yours. If the collar were stolen and the museum's security compromised, it would support your argument that such treasures require private stewardship. Marcus turned on him. And you, Mr. Thornbury, a London art dealer who specializes in rare jewelry, just happens to be present when a medieval collar vanishes. I wonder what your clients might pay for such a piece, no questions asked. I deal in legitimate acquisitions only, Thornbury replied coolly. My reputation, yes, everyone's reputation is spotless, Marcus sneered. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, when we're all locked in a building with a thief. Miss Marple stirred in her chair. If I might venture an observation, she said mildly, there is one aspect of this situation that strikes me as particularly curious. All eyes turned to her. She continued in her gentle, apologetic tone. The forgery itself must have taken considerable time and skill to create. Someone had to study the original collar extensively, obtain matching materials, and execute the work with sufficient quality to pass casual inspection. This suggests planning that began weeks or even months ago. Precisely my point about young Ledger, Marcus said triumphantly. He's had months of access. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, as has Professor Ashworth, who has been working with the collection since November. And you, Mr. Caldwell, had access to the manor house before it was converted to a museum. The collar was discovered only 18 months ago, but it had been hidden in that wall for centuries. One wonders whether anyone might have known of its existence before the official discovery. Marcus's face darkened. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Miss Marple said sweetly. I'm simply noting that families often have knowledge of hidden treasures that doesn't appear in official records. Rather like the Fortescues, you remember them, Dolly, who claimed to have no knowledge of the silver plate in their attic until the insurance appraiser found it. Though of course, their great-aunt had mentioned it in her diary, which the family had naturally read. Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. Oh yes, that was quite the scandal. Before Marcus could respond, Inspector Craddock emerged from the office. His expression was grave. I'd like to speak with Miss Sarah Ledger, please. Sarah went pale, but walked steadily to the office. The door closed behind her, and the murmur of conversation immediately swelled. Miss Marple noticed that Timothy had appeared at the far end of the corridor, presumably having just finished his own interview. His face was drawn and exhausted, and he slumped against the wall as though his legs might give out. Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly smoking his pipe in the corner, moved to the young man's side. Steady on, Ledger. This will sort itself out, will it? Timothy's voice was hollow. My career is finished. Even if they find the collar, no one will trust me with a collection again. And if they don't find it, he broke off, pressing his hands to his face. I can't believe this is happening. Everything was perfect this morning. Everything. Things are often perfect just before they fall apart, Miss Marple observed quietly. Rather like the Hendersons' garden party, you remember, Dolly. Such beautiful weather, everyone in excellent spirits, and then young Gerald found the body in the folly. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. Must you bring that up, Jane? I mention it only because it illustrates a pattern, Miss Marple continued. Crimes are rarely committed on impulse. They're planned, often meticulously, and the planning reveals character. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to steal that collar today, or perhaps to make it appear to have been stolen today. One must ask why this particular day was chosen. Professor Ashworth had been listening with interest. She approached Miss Marple's chair. You make an excellent point. The reopening ceremony was planned months in advance. Anyone who wanted to time a theft to coincide with maximum confusion and the largest number of suspects would have known about today. Or, Gerald Thornbury added thoughtfully, someone needed the theft discovered immediately rather than later. If the switch had been made weeks ago, it might have gone unnoticed for months. But today, with the case opened and the forgery viewed at close range by experts, discovery was inevitable and immediate. Why would anyone want immediate discovery? Dr. Haydock asked, puzzled. Miss Marple smiled gently. That, I think, is the question at the heart of this mystery. What advantage is gained by having the theft discovered during a ceremonial reopening, surrounded by witnesses, with access limited and security highest? It seems rather counterproductive for a thief unless the theft itself wasn't the point. She paused, glancing around the room. In my experience, when something appears to make no sense, it's usually because we're missing a crucial piece of information. Something that would make all the apparently irrational actions perfectly logical. Inspector Craddock emerged again, this time accompanied by a visibly shaken Sarah Ledger. The inspector's face was set in grim lines. I'm going to have to ask you all to remain available for further questioning. At this time, no one is being charged, but this is a serious matter. The Caldwell collar was insured for £220,000, and its historical value is incalculable. Have you found any leads? Colonel Melchett asked. We're pursuing several lines of inquiry, Craddock replied carefully. The museum's security footage is being reviewed, though I'll note that the cameras don't cover the interior of Timothy Ledger's office, where the duplicate key was kept. We're also examining the forgery itself, which may yield clues about who created it. And the guests? Marcus demanded. Surely you're not simply letting everyone leave. I've taken statements from everyone present. For now, that must suffice. Ladies and gentlemen, you're free to go, but please don't leave the village without informing me. The crowd slowly dispersed, some lingering to gossip, others hurrying away as though anxious to distance themselves from the scandal. Miss Marple remained in her chair, apparently in no hurry. She watched as Timothy and Sarah Ledger spoke in low, urgent voices near the display cases. She observed Marcus Caldwell's satisfied expression as he departed. She noted Gerald Thornbury's thoughtful demeanor and Professor Ashworth's troubled frown. When the room had nearly cleared, Miss Marple finally rose and approached the display case. The forgery still sat inside, a glittering reminder of audacity and skill. She bent closer, studying not the jewelry itself but the case around it, the floor beneath it, the wall behind it. Remarkable craftsmanship, isn't it? Professor Ashworth had written. The papers are calling it the crime of the decade, Aunt Jane. Raymond's voice crackled through the line. A medieval treasure vanishing from a locked case during its own unveiling. It has all the elements of a sensational mystery. Rather too sensational, I think, Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking rhythmically. There's something theatrical about it all, as though someone wanted it to be dramatic. Well, I hope they catch the culprit soon. The museum's reputation is in tatters. Young Ledger will be lucky to find work as a library assistant after this. After promising to update Raymond if developments occurred, Miss Marple set down the telephone and resumed her knitting. But her mind was not on the delicate pattern she was creating. Instead, she was reviewing everything she had observed the previous day, comparing it to similar situations she had witnessed over the decades. There had been the case of the missing silver at the vicarage, which turned out to have been hidden by the vicar himself to claim insurance before his gambling debts came to light. There had been the matter of Mrs. Trevelyan's jewelry, reported stolen but actually sold months earlier to cover her son's losses at the races. And there had been that peculiar business with the Weatherby collection, where the theft had been staged to cover evidence of previous embezzlement. In each case, the theft had been only the surface. Beneath it lay deeper secrets, more complex motivations. Miss Marple suspected the Caldwell collar's disappearance would prove equally layered. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She was surprised to find Sarah Ledger on her doorstep, looking exhausted and desperate. Miss Marple, I'm sorry to intrude, but I didn't know where else to turn. May I speak with you? Of course, my dear. Come in, come in. You look quite done in. Let me make us some tea. Once they were settled in the parlor, Sarah began to speak in a rush. Everyone thinks Timothy did it. Even Inspector Craddock, though he's too professional to say so directly. The evidence is all circumstantial, but it's damning. Timothy had access. He had knowledge. He was in debt. Is he in debt? Miss Marple asked gently. Sarah's composure cracked. Yes, our father died 2 years ago, and he left considerable medical bills. Timothy took out loans to cover them and to support our mother. He would never steal, Miss Marple, but he is desperate financially. Anyone investigating will discover that immediately. And you? Miss Marple asked. You're the deputy curator. You had access to the alarm codes and presumably to your brother's keys. Sarah looked stricken. Are you suggesting I'm a suspect too? I'm suggesting that the police will consider everyone with opportunity. It's their job. But I'm also suggesting that appearances can be deceiving. Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. Tell me about the forgery. Had you ever seen it before yesterday? No, never. I didn't even know it existed until it was revealed in the case. And your brother's keys were, they often, unattended. Sarah hesitated. Timothy is somewhat absent. He would set them down while working and forget where he'd put them. I often had to help him find them. But they were always in the museum somewhere, usually in his office or the workroom. So someone familiar with his habits could have borrowed them temporarily. I suppose so, but Sarah broke off, her eyes widening. Miss Marple, are you saying someone else had access? That Timothy is being framed? I'm saying that is one possibility among several. Tell me, who else knew about the duplicate key in your brother's office? Only Professor Ashworth and Mr. Caldwell. Timothy mentioned it to them during the security briefing in February. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see, and this Mr. Thornbury, the art dealer, when exactly did he express interest in viewing the collection? About 6 weeks ago. He wrote to Timothy asking if he might attend the reopening. He said he'd heard about the discovery and was curious to see it in person. Timothy was flattered by the attention from such a respected dealer. Naturally. And Professor Ashworth, how long has she been working with the collection? Since November. She came highly recommended by the British Museum. Her expertise in medieval jewelry is unparalleled. She must have spent a great deal of time studying the collar. Oh, yes. She practically lived in the museum for weeks, photographing and measuring every piece. She was very thorough. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. One more question, my dear. The discovery of the collar during the renovation, was it widely reported? Yes, it made all the local papers and several national ones. The Historical Society wrote it up in their journal. It was quite the sensation, so anyone with an interest in medieval artifacts would have known about it for over a year. Plenty of time to plan something elaborate. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Sarah, I wonder if you might do something for me. Could you obtain a copy of Professor Ashworth's authentication report? The full 40 pages she mentioned. Sarah looked confused but nodded. I think Timothy has a copy in his office. But why? Just a notion, Miss Marple said with her gentle smile. An old woman's curiosity. Sometimes the most innocent documents contain the most revealing information. After Sarah left, promising to deliver the report by evening, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long moment. Then she picked up the telephone and placed a call to her nephew Raymond in London. Raymond, dear, I need you to research something for me. I want to know everything about recent sales of medieval jewelry, particularly pieces that might be similar to the Caldwell collar. And I'd like to know about a dealer named Gerald Thornbury, his reputation, his client list if possible, and any controversies in his career. Aunt Jane, are you playing detective again? Raymond sounded amused. I'm simply satisfying an old woman's curiosity. You know how I am about loose ends. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the museum. Inspector Craddock had left a constable on duty, and the building remained closed to the public. She found Timothy Ledger in his office, surrounded by papers, looking utterly defeated. Miss Marple, he said dully, I'm afraid we're not open. I know, dear. I came to see how you were managing, and to ask a few questions, if you don't mind. Timothy gestured helplessly at the chaos around him. Ask anything you like. Nothing matters now, anyway. When you checked the collar yesterday morning, what specifically did you look for? Timothy frowned, clearly trying to remember. I did my usual security check. I verified that the case was locked and the alarm was active. I looked through the glass at the collar itself. It was there exactly as it should be. But you didn't open the case. No, there was no need. I could see it perfectly well through the glass. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the forgery, when you finally examined it closely yesterday, what differences did you notice? The weight was wrong, Timothy said immediately. When I lifted it, it felt lighter than the original, and the garnets were slightly different in color. The craftsmanship was excellent, but not quite perfect. A true medieval piece has certain irregularities that machinage precision can't quite replicate. So someone with expertise would have noticed immediately upon handling it. Yes, absolutely. But through glass, under those lights, it was convincing enough. Which suggests, Miss Marple mused, that the substitution was intended to be discovered quickly, not to fool experts for any length of time. How very curious. Timothy looked at her with dawning hope. You don't think I did it, do you? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that this crime is more complex than it appears. And I think the solution lies not in who had opportunity, but in who had motive. And I don't mean simply the motive to steal a valuable object. By evening, Sarah had delivered Professor Ashworth's authentication report as promised. Miss Marple settled into her armchair with a pot of tea and began to read. The document was indeed thorough, 43 pages of detailed analysis. Measurements, photographs. How convenient, Miss Marple murmured. And do they believe it? Craddock's skeptical, but he has to follow up. The letter contained details about the museum's security system that weren't public knowledge. Someone with inside information sent it, or someone who wants the investigation to look in a particular direction. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Tell me, Doctor, in your medical opinion, would it be possible to conceal something small inside a piece of jewelry like the Caldwell collar? Dr. Haydock looked surprised. I suppose so. Medieval goldsmiths were quite skilled. A hollow compartment wouldn't be unprecedented. Why do you ask? Oh, just a thought. Rather like those lockets that held poison in Gothic novels. Pure fancy, I'm sure. But it wasn't fancy, and Miss Marple knew it. The pattern was becoming clearer. She spent the afternoon making discreet inquiries around the village, and what she learned was illuminating. From the postmistress, she discovered that Marcus Caldwell had received a registered letter from a London solicitor 2 weeks before the museum opening. From the grocer, she learned that Professor Ashworth had made several trips to London in March, staying overnight each time. From young Tommy Bond, who did odd jobs around the village. She heard that Gerald Thornbury had been seen examining the museum's exterior late one evening in February, supposedly admiring the architecture. Each piece of information alone meant little. Together, they suggested careful preparation by multiple parties. That evening, Miss Marple received a telephone call from Raymond. "Aunt Jane, I've got that information you wanted. Gerald Thornbury is indeed a respected dealer, but there's an interesting footnote to his career. About 5 years ago, he was peripherally involved in a scandal concerning a supposedly lost Elizabethan miniature that turned out to have been in private hands all along. Nothing was ever proved against him, but there were suggestions he'd helped facilitate a quiet sale to avoid inheritance tax issues." "How very enlightening," Miss Marple said. "And medieval jewelry sales. Nothing matching the Caldwell collar, which isn't surprising given its uniqueness. But there's been increased interest in medieval pieces in the past year. Several significant private sales at auction. The market is quite hot at the moment. Thank you, Raymond. You've been most helpful." After she hung up, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence. Then she reached for her writing paper and began to compose several notes. By midnight, her plan was complete. The following afternoon, Miss Marple hosted an unexpected tea party. She had invited Professor Ashworth, Sarah Ledger, and, somewhat surprisingly, Marcus Caldwell. Timothy had not been included, and this omission was deliberate. "I appreciate you all coming," Miss Marple said as they settled in her parlor. "I know these are difficult circumstances, but I've been giving the matter of the Caldwell collar considerable thought, and I believe I may have stumbled upon something relevant." Marcus Caldwell looked skeptical. "With all due respect, Miss Marple, this is a matter for the police." "Indeed, it is. But sometimes an outside perspective can be helpful. You see, I've been wondering about the collar's history. Professor Ashworth, in your research, did you investigate why it was hidden behind that wall?" Professor Ashworth set down her teacup. "The most likely explanation is that it was concealed during the dissolution of the monasteries, or possibly during the Civil War. Families often hid valuables during periods of unrest, and it remained hidden for centuries," Miss Marple continued, "which suggests either the person who hid it died without revealing the location, or the location was deliberately kept secret within the family." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Family legends mention hidden treasures, but nothing specific. The wall was only discovered during renovation because of water damage." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said mildly. "Or perhaps unfortunate, depending on one's perspective. Tell me, Mr. Caldwell, when did you first learn about the collar's discovery?" "When the museum board announced it publicly. I was not consulted, despite being the family heir. But you were aware of family legends about hidden treasures. Vague stories, nothing more. Every old family has such tales." Miss Marple smiled gently, rather like the Weatherby family, who claimed ignorance of the silver supposedly lost in a fire, until it turned out to be safely deposited in a Swiss bank. Family memory can be curiously selective. The atmosphere in the room had grown tense. Sarah Ledger spoke up nervously. "Miss Marple, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps the collar itself is less important than what it might contain. Professor Ashworth, you noted a density variation in your report. A possible hollow space in the central medallion." Professor Ashworth's eyes widened. "Yes, but the museum board declined to fund further investigation. One wonders why, when such a discovery might have added considerably to the collar's historical value. Unless, of course, someone preferred that the hollow space remained uninvestigated. Marcus Caldwell stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to these insinuations. Please sit down, Mr. Caldwell, Miss Marple said, her voice still gentle but carrying unexpected authority. I think we all need to hear this. You see, I believe the Caldwell collar was stolen not for its monetary value, but to gain access to whatever it conceals. And I believe the thief knew about the hollow space, perhaps had known for quite some time. That's preposterous, Marcus blustered, but he sat down. Is it? Consider the facts. The forgery took months to create, suggesting the theft was planned long before the reopening. Yet the substitution was made in such a way that discovery was inevitable and immediate. Why? Because the thief needed the case opened, needed to handle the original collar, and needed to do so under circumstances where their actions would be hidden by the general confusion. Professor Ashworth leaned forward. You're saying the theft was a distraction. I'm saying the theft may have been incidental to the true crime. Someone needed to examine that collar closely, perhaps to open the hollow space, and the chaos of the opening ceremony provided perfect cover. Sarah Marple looked stricken. But that means the collar might still be in the museum. It might never have left the building at all. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Hidden somewhere during the confusion, to be retrieved later when suspicion had died down. This is madness, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple turned to Professor Ashworth. You made several trips to London in March, visiting the British Museum to consult their archives, I presume. Professor Ashworth hesitated. Yes, among other things. I was researching the Caldwell family history. And did you discover anything interesting? Several things. The Caldwells had connections to prominent Catholic families during Elizabeth I's reign. There were rumors they harbored priests and held secret masses. How very dangerous, Miss Marple murmured. And if one were hiding evidence of Catholic sympathies, a piece of jewelry might serve as an excellent concealment. A hollow space could hold a document, perhaps, something that might be valuably dangerous even centuries later. Marcus had gone pale. You're talking about treason. My ancestors were loyal to the crown. I'm talking about survival during perilous times. Many families made difficult choices, but if evidence of those choices still existed, sealed inside a collar that was about to be handled by experts and possibly x-rayed for a museum catalogue, someone would want to retrieve it first, Professor Ashworth finished, before it became public knowledge. Exactly. The question is, who knew about the hollow space, and who had the most to lose or gain from its contents? The room fell silent. Then Marcus Caldwell spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. My great-uncle knew. He told me about it 2 months before he died. He said the collar held a secret that could destroy the family's reputation. He made me promise never to reveal it. But he left the estate to the museum anyway, Sarah said. He was dying and in pain. His mind wasn't clear. I tried to contest the will, but Marcus trailed off. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And when the collar was about to be displayed, you realized the secret might be discovered. So you arranged to steal it, or rather, to make it appear stolen while you actually retrieved whatever was hidden inside. No. Marcus stood again, his face flushed. I wanted to stop the exhibition, yes, but I didn't steal anything. I couldn't have. I don't have the expertise to create a forgery. Perhaps not. "The truth about why the Caldwell collar was stolen," she replied. "Though I must confess, I'm not entirely certain I have all the pieces yet. There's still one element that doesn't quite fit." Inspector Craddock's arrival changed the dynamic in the room completely. Marcus Caldwell immediately began protesting his innocence, while Sarah Ledger looked terrified, and Professor Ashworth maintained her professional composure with visible effort. "Perhaps," Craddock said, settling into a chair, "Miss Marple should explain her theory from the beginning." Miss Marple nodded. "It began with a simple observation. The theft made no practical sense. The forgery was too elaborate, the timing too risky, the method too complex. Unless one considers that the theft itself might have been secondary to another purpose." She outlined her reasoning about the hollow space, the hidden document, and the multiple parties who might have known about it. Craddock listened intently, making notes. "An interesting theory," he said when she finished. "But where's your proof?" "I was hoping," Miss Marple admitted, "that one of the people in this room might provide it. Someone knows more than they've revealed." Before anyone could respond, Miss Marple's telephone rang. She excused herself to answer it, and her expression changed as she listened. "I see," she said. "Yes, I understand. Thank you for calling." She returned to the parlor, her face grave. "That was Dr. Haydock. Timothy Ledger has been found unconscious in his office at the museum. He's being taken to hospital now." The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Sarah Ledger went white and made for the door, but Craddock stopped her. "Just a moment, Miss Ledger. What was your brother doing at the museum?" I don't know. He wasn't supposed to be there. The museum is still closed." Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "Did Dr. Haydock say what happened?" "He found a head wound. It appears Timothy was struck from behind." "Then this is no longer just a theft," Craddock said grimly. "Someone has graduated to violence. Miss Marple, I think you'd better tell me everything you suspect, speculation and all." Miss Marple sat down slowly. "Very well. I believe Timothy discovered something, perhaps where the collar was hidden within the museum. Or perhaps he realized who the thief was. He may have confronted them, or they may have realized he was getting too close to the truth. But who?" Sarah cried. "Who would hurt Timothy?" "Someone who feels threatened," Miss Marple said. "Someone who has invested too much in this scheme to allow it to unravel now. Someone who may have been working with an accomplice, but now finds themselves in deeper waters than anticipated." She looked around the room at each face in turn. "Inspector, I recommend you search the museum immediately. I don't believe the collar has left the building. It's hidden somewhere that seemed safe during the confusion of the opening day, but Timothy may have found it." Craddock nodded and reached for his radio. Within minutes, additional officers were on their way to the museum. "In the meantime," Craddock said, "I'd like you all to remain here. No one leaves until we've sorted this out." The wait was agonizing. Sarah paced nervously. Marcus sat rigidly, his face set. Professor Ashworth stared out the window. Miss Marple knitted steadily, her needles clicking in the tense silence. It was nearly an hour before Craddock's radio crackled to life. The message was brief but significant. The officers had found the Caldwell collar hidden inside a locked storage cabinet in the museum's basement. A cabinet that required a key Timothy Ledger would have had access to. So Timothy did take it, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. He probably panicked when suspicion fell on him and tried to retrieve it, but his conscience got the better of him. Or perhaps an accomplice turned on him. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, Someone placed it there, knowing it would incriminate Timothy further if found. The perfect scapegoater curator with debts, access, and opportunity. Who would question his guilt once the collar was found in a location only he could access? That cabinet isn't restricted to Timothy alone, Sarah protested. I have a key, and so does Mrs. Patterson, the cleaning woman. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Which opens up possibilities, doesn't it? Craddock's expression was thoughtful. The collar's been found, but we still don't know who put it there or who attacked Timothy Ledger. Miss Marple, you've been building to something. What is it? Miss Marple set down her knitting. I believe we need to examine the collar itself. Specifically, we need to open that hollow space in the central medallion and discover what it contains. I suspect that will answer all our questions. The collar is evidence now, Craddock said. I can't authorize damaging it, even if doing so might reveal the motive for assault. Miss Marple asked. Inspector, someone was desperate enough to commit violence. Whatever is hidden in that collar is worth protecting at any cost. Craddock considered, then nodded. I'll arrange for it to be examined by experts tomorrow morning, under controlled conditions. Tomorrow might be too late, Miss Marple said urgently. Whoever attacked Timothy may try again if they believe he can identify them, or they may flee entirely. We need to act now, tonight. There was something in her voice, a certainty that commanded attention. Craddock studied her face for a long moment, then made a decision. Very well. We'll take the collar to the police station and have it examined there. But I want everyone in this room present as witnesses. If this is the breakthrough Miss Marple believes it is, I want no questions about the chain of evidence. The police station's evidence room was crowded. In addition to Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock, and the 3 suspects from the Tea Party, Dr. Haydock had been summoned for his medical expertise, and Gerald Thornbury had been collected from his hotel. The art dealer looked both curious and wary. The Caldwell collar lay on a white cloth under bright lights. Even in these utilitarian it was magnificent. Mr. Thornbury, Craddock said, as an expert in medieval jewelry, I'm asking you to examine this piece and determine if there is indeed a hollow space within the central medallion. Thornbury stepped forward, producing a jeweler's loupe. He studied the collar for several minutes in absolute silence. Yes, he said finally, there's definitely something here. The medallion is actually a locket of sorts, quite cleverly constructed. The clasp is hidden within the decorative scrollwork. At Craddock's nod, Thornbury worked carefully at the medallion. There was a soft click, and the central ornament hinged open. Inside, preserved in a tiny cavity lined with wax, was a rolled piece of parchment no larger than a thumb. The room held its collective breath as Thornbury carefully extracted it. With infinite care, he unrolled it on the cloth. The document was in Latin, written in a medieval hand. Professor Ashworth leaned in, her scholarly instincts overriding her predicament. It's a letter, she breathed. Dated 1586, addressed to Sir Edmund Caldwell from... Good God, it's signed by William Cardinal Allen, who? Craddock asked. One of the leaders of the English Catholic exiles, Professor Ashworth explained, her voice shaking with excitement despite the circumstances. He was instrumental in planning the Spanish Armada. This letter, she continued reading, her face growing pale. This letter thanks Sir Edmund for his financial support of the Catholic cause and mentions his role in hiding Jesuit priests. It essentially proves the Caldwell family were traitors to Elizabeth I. Marcus Caldwell made a strangled sound. This is what my great-uncle wanted to hide. This is why he tried to keep the collar from being displayed. Not quite, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Timothy Ledger stood there, his head bandaged but his eyes clear. Beside him was a uniformed constable, Timothy. Sarah rushed to her brother, but Craddock held up a hand. Mr. Ledger, you should be in hospital. I discharged myself against medical advice, Timothy said, because I remembered something. Something that explains everything. He walked slowly into the room, his eyes fixed on Gerald Thornbury. You didn't come to the museum 6 weeks ago out of professional curiosity. You came because Marcus Caldwell hired you. Thornbury's expression didn't change, but Miss Marple noticed his hands tighten almost imperceptibly. That's absurd, Marcus blustered. I've never. You hired him to create the forgery, Timothy continued. You knew about the hidden document from your great-uncle. You knew it could destroy your family's reputation and probably any chance of your lineage being accepted in certain social circles. You needed to retrieve it before the collar was publicly examined in detail. Prove it, Marcus snapped. I can, Timothy said quietly. When I was struck today, I was in the basement storage room. I'd gone there because I found something odd in the museum's security footage. Footage the police hadn't reviewed yet because it was from the day before the opening. It showed Mr. Thornbury entering my office after hours. He must have made impressions of my keys then. But he couldn't steal them or I'd have noticed, so he had copies made. Craddock's expression hardened. Is this true, Mr. Thornbury? Thornbury said nothing, but his silence was damning. Timothy wasn't finished. You created the forgery weeks ago. On the day of the opening, you arrived early before I did, using your copied keys. You switched the collars then, while the building was still empty. All that business with pickpocketing my key during the ceremony was theatre. The real switch had already happened. But why attack you today? Sarah asked. Because I was reviewing the security footage and realized what it showed. I confronted Mr. Thornbury this afternoon when he returned to the museum claiming he'd left his notebook there. He must have struck me before I could tell anyone else. Craddock moved toward Thornbury. Mr. Thornbury, I'm placing you under arrest for theft and assault. You have the right to wait, Miss Marple said sharply. I'm afraid that's not quite right either. The room fell silent. Timothy stared at her in confusion. Mr. Thornbury did create the forgery, I believe, Miss Marple continued. And he may have entered the museum after hours. But he didn't switch the collars. Then who did? Craddock demanded. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Professor Ashworth. Someone who had even greater access and whose expertise meant they could handle the collar without arousing suspicion. Someone who knew about the hidden document and desperately wanted to read it before it became public knowledge. Someone whose entire professional reputation rested on publishing that discovery themselves. Professor Ashworth's face had gone ashen. You can't possibly. You've been writing a book on medieval Catholic resistance, haven't you, Professor? I took the liberty of checking with Raymond, who has connections in academic publishing. A book that would make your career if you could include a genuine, previously unknown document from William Cardinal Allen. That doesn't prove you were the one who switched the collars during the opening ceremony. Miss Marple said firmly. You had the alarm code. And Timothy, I'm afraid your sister Sarah provided you with an alibi that isn't quite accurate. Sarah, when exactly did you see your brother check the collar that morning? Sarah looked stricken. I didn't actually see him check it. I just assumed you assumed because Timothy said he had. But Timothy, you told me you looked through the glass without opening the case. You couldn't have verified the collar's authenticity without handling it. The switch could have been made. The night before, when Professor Ashworth worked late at the museum, she could have used her alarm code to access the case, made the switch, and relocked it. No one would have questioned her being there. Late she often worked into the evening. Professor Ashworth's composure finally shattered. I spent 30 years building my reputation. That document would have been the crowning achievement of my career. I wasn't going to let some provincial museum claim it. But you didn't account for one thing, Miss Marple continued gently. Mr. Caldwell hired Mr. Thornbury independently to steal the collar and destroy the document entirely. Two separate schemes, working at cross purposes. When Mr. Thornbury realized during the opening ceremony that the collar had already been switched, he knew something had gone wrong. And when Timothy started asking questions, Professor Ashworth panicked. I didn't mean to hurt him, Professor Ashworth whispered. He was getting too close, and I thought if I hid the collar in the storage room, it would look like he'd stolen it himself. I just wanted time to photograph the document properly, to verify my translation. I barely touched him, just enough to keep him quiet, while I wile you what? Miss Marple's voice was sharp now. While you let an innocent man take the blame for your crime, while you destroyed a young man's career and reputation to protect your own. Professor Ashworth had no answer. Inspector Craddock moved decisively. Professor Diana Ashworth, I'm arresting you for theft and assault. Gerald Thornbury, you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft and for illegal entry. He nodded to his constables, who moved forward with handcuffs. As they were led away, Marcus Caldwell slumped in his chair. What happens to the document now? It becomes part of the historical record, Craddock said. Your ancestors' actions were nearly 500 years ago, Mr. Caldwell. I doubt it will affect your standing as much as you fear. Actually, Timothy said, his voice stronger now, it makes the collar even more historically significant. This will put our museum on the map properly. Miss Marple smiled gently. And you, my dear Timothy, have solved your financial problems. The publicity from this discovery will bring visitors from all over the country. The museum will flourish. 3 days later, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with Mrs. Bantry, reviewing the events while knitting placidly. I still don't understand how you knew, Mrs. Bantry said. Everyone suspected Timothy, and even you seemed to think Mr. Caldwell was involved. Mr. Caldwell was involved, Miss Marple corrected. He hired Mr. Thornbury to create the forgery and destroy the document. But he made the mistake of hiring a man who saw an opportunity for greater profit. Mr. Thornbury realized that stealing the collar intact would be far more lucrative than simply destroying it. He could sell it quietly to a collector and make a fortune. So there were actually 3 different plots. Precisely, Mr. Caldwell wanted the document destroyed. Mr. Thornbury wanted the collar stolen, and Professor Ashworth wanted the document for herself. The comedy or tragedy is that they all worked at cross purposes, each assuming they were the only one with a scheme. But how did you know it? Was Professor Ashworth who actually made the switch? Miss Marple set down her knitting. Several small things. First, she was the only person other than Timothy who could handle the collar without arousing suspicion. She'd spent months studying it, photographing it. If someone had seen her examining it during the ceremony, they'd have thought nothing of it. Second, when the forgery was discovered, she was the first to examine it closely, and she did so without gloves. A true scholar would never handle a medieval artifact without proper protection unless they already knew it was a forgery. Third, her reaction to finding the collar in the storage room was telling. She wasn't surprised. She was calculating. She was trying to determine if Timothy had found the document or just the collar itself. And finally, there was the matter of timing. Professor Ashworth knew Timothy's habits intimately. She knew he checked the displays every morning through the glass without opening the cases. She knew she had from the night before the opening until the case was actually opened during the ceremony to make her plans. She would have had time to examine the document, photograph it, and then hide both the forgery and the original where they'd eventually be found in ways that would incriminate Timothy. Mrs. Bantry shook her head, and she nearly succeeded. She would have succeeded if she hadn't panicked when Timothy found that security footage. Violence is always a mistake, Dolly. It reveals desperation, and desperate people make errors. What about Mr. Thornbury and Mr. Caldwell? Mr. Thornbury will be charged with conspiracy and illegal entry. He'll lose his dealer's license and reputation, which for a man like him is worse than prison. Mr. Caldwell won't be charged theirs. No proof of his involvement beyond circumstantial evidence, and Mr. Thornbury isn't likely to implicate him. Marcus has lost his battle to keep the family secret hidden, but Timothy is being remarkably gracious about it. He's planning an exhibition on Catholic resistance in Elizabethan England, with the Caldwell connection as its centerpiece, and the collar itself will be displayed in a new, even more secure case, complete with the Cardinal Allen letter. Professor Ashworth's authentication work was excellent. Ironically enough, the museum board has already seen an uptick in inquiries from scholars and tourists. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. It's a reminder, Dolly, that crimes are often far more complex than they first appear. Everyone assumes theft is about greed or need, but sometimes it's about pride, reputation, or legacy. Professor Ashworth didn't need money, she needed recognition. Mr. Caldwell didn't need the collar, he needed the document destroyed. Understanding what people truly value is the key to understanding their crimes. You make it sound so simple. Human nature is simple, Miss Marple said with her gentle smile. We all want something: respect, security, love, recognition. The question is always, how far will someone go to get it? And that, my dear, is where the tragedy lies. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its normal rhythms over the following weeks, though the scandal of the Caldwell collar provided gossip for months. Miss Marple observed these conversations with her usual interest, but declined to add to them beyond confirming basic facts. She did, however, receive a visit from Timothy and Sarah Ledger on a pleasant May afternoon. They found her in her garden, tending to her roses. Miss Marple, Timothy said, his face bright with gratitude, we wanted to thank you properly. If you hadn't pieced everything together, I might be facing criminal charges right now. Nonsense, Miss Marple said, snipping a dead bloom. Inspector Craddock would have sorted it out, eventually. I simply hastened the process a bit. You saved my career. It's genuine, a historically significant discovery. I'm very pleased for you, dear. And for the museum. It's nice when things work out properly. Sarah stepped forward, holding a small package. We wanted you to have this. It's just a token, but we thought you might appreciate it. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound copy of the museum's new exhibition catalogue, personally inscribed by Timothy. To Miss Jane Marple, whose keen observation and understanding of human nature solved the mystery of the Caldwell collar. With deepest gratitude, Miss Marple was genuinely touched. Thank you both. This is lovely. I shall treasure it. As they were leaving, Timothy paused. "Miss Marple, may I ask when did you first suspect Professor Ashworth?" Miss Marple considered. "The moment she examined the forgery without gloves, I think. It was such a small thing, but revealing. A true scholar's instinct would have been to protect the artifact, even a false one, until its nature was confirmed. But she already knew it was false, you see, so she didn't bother with the protection. It was a tiny lapse in her careful performance, but enough to make me wonder." After they left, Miss Marple returned to her roses. The garden was particularly lovely this time of year, with everything in full bloom. She thought about the case as she worked, turning over its various elements in her mind. The truth, she reflected, was that everyone involved had been driven by fear of exposure, fear of professional failure, fear of financial ruin, fear of family disgrace. Fear made people do desperate things, and desperate people were dangerous. But there was a lesson in it too. Professor Ashworth's downfall had come not from her crime itself, but from her inability to trust in her own abilities. She was a brilliant scholar who could have published revolutionary work on the Cardinal Allen letter through legitimate channels. But she'd wanted exclusive credit, wanted to be the sole discoverer, and that ambition had corrupted her judgment. Marcus Caldwell's fear of family shame had driven him to conspiracy, nearly destroying an innocent young man's career. Gerald Thornbury's greed had led him to betray professional ethics. All of them had possessed legitimate paths to their goals, but fear and impatience had led them to crime instead. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured to herself, deadheading another rose. Always the same, in every generation. That evening, as she sat by her window with her knitting, watching the last light fade from the village square, Miss Marple reflected on justice. Professor Ashworth would face trial and likely prison. Her reputation was destroyed, her career finished. Gerald Thornbury had already been released on bail, but would face professional ruin regardless of his sentence. Marcus Caldwell had escaped legal consequences, but had become a pariah in the village, his social standing irreparably damaged, and Timothy Ledger, the innocent party, had emerged stronger. His museum thrived. His reputation was enhanced. He'd found an unexpected ally in Marcus, who had quietly donated funds for enhanced security systems, perhaps as penance, perhaps simply as pragmatism to protect what remained of the Caldwell legacy. Justice, Miss Marple thought, didn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it came from the natural consequences of one's choices, from the way communities responded to truth, from the resilience of good people facing adversity. A few days later, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Craddock arrived mid-morning with a formal-looking document. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair she offered, "I've been authorized to offer you a consultancy with the police. Your insights in this case were invaluable, and there are other unsolved matters where your perspective might prove useful." Miss Marple smiled, but shook her head gently. "That's very kind, Inspector, but I'm afraid I must decline. I'm just an old woman who notices things. I have no formal training, no credentials. What I do isn't really detective work, it's simply observation of human nature, based on a lifetime in a small village. That observation solved this case when conventional investigation was stalled." Craddock pointed out, "Perhaps, but you would have reached the same conclusion eventually. I merely connected dots that were already visible to anyone who cared to look." She poured him tea. "Besides, Inspector, I'm quite content with my quiet life here. Gardens to tend, friends to visit, village affairs to observe. That's quite enough excitement for someone my age." Craddock accepted this with good grace, though Miss Marple suspected he'd hoped for a different answer. After he left, she returned to her knitting with a sense of satisfaction. The Caldwell collar case had been fascinating, layers within layers, multiple schemes intersecting, human weaknesses colliding with desperate ambitions. But it was solved now, justice had been served, and life in St. Mary Mead could return to its pleasant, predictable rhythms, or so she thought, until the following Tuesday, when young Griselda Clement burst into her parlour with startling news about a suspicious death at the vicarage. But that, as Miss Marple reflected while reaching for her coat, was another story entirely. For now, the mystery of the museum where exhibits became crimes was closed. The Caldwell collar rested safely in its new case, the Cardinal Allen letter preserved beside it. Visitors came from across England to see them, both a testament to history's dark complexities and the enduring human capacity for both treachery and truth. And in her cottage overlooking the village square, Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite chair, knitting steadily while watching the daily life of St. Mary Mead unfold before her. She was content, knowing that when the next puzzle presented itself, as it inevitably would be ready. Human nature never changed, after all, and Miss Marple had been studying it for a very long time indeed.